I never thought my life would take such a drastic turn in just one night. My name is Isabella, I'm 27 years old, and until recently, I thought I had a perfect life. I was married to Ryan, the man I thought was the love of my life, and we lived together in a nice apartment in downtown. We had plans, dreams, and a bright future ahead. Or so I thought. It all started with a dinner invitation. My mother called us on a Thursday afternoon to invite Ryan and me to dinner the following Saturday. It wasn't unusual. We used to get together at least once a month to catch up. However, this time there was something different in her voice. She sounded nervous, almost anxious. "Isabella, honey," my mother said, in a tone that tried to be casual. "Chuck and I want to invite you to dinner this Saturday. There's a new restaurant downtown that we'd love to try with you." My stepfather. Just hearing his name made me feel uncomfortable in my stomach. We had never had a close relationship since he married my mother 5 years ago. There was always something about him that made me nervous. A look that lasted too long, a comment that bordered on inappropriate, but I never gave it much importance. After all, he was my mother's husband and she seemed happy. "Sure, Mom," I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. "I'll tell Ryan and we'll confirm." After hanging up, I stared at the phone for a moment. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't identify what it was. I shook my head, trying to get rid of that feeling. It was just a family dinner. What could go wrong? Saturday arrived faster than I expected. Ryan and I dressed up for the occasion. I chose a black dress that reached just above my knees, elegant, but not too formal. Ryan looked handsome in his blue shirt and dress pants. As we were getting ready, I noticed he was unusually quiet. "Everything okay, love?" I asked as I applied lipstick in front of the mirror. He looked at me through the reflection and smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, everything's fine. I'm just a little tired from work." I nodded, but I couldn't help feeling there was something more. Lately, Ryan had been working late, coming home exhausted and distant. I tried not to overthink it. We all go through tough phases at work, right? We arrived at the restaurant punctually at 8 p.m. It was an elegant place, with dim lights and soft background music. My mother and Chuck were already seated at a table near the window. Seeing us, my mother stood up with a radiant smile and hugged us both. "It's so good to see you kids," she exclaimed, kissing us on the cheeks. "You look fantastic." Chuck stood up slowly, his gaze running over me from head to toe before greeting. "Isabella, you look beautiful," he said, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Then, he turned to Ryan and shook his hand. "Ryan, good to see you." We sat down and ordered our drinks. I noticed that Ryan ordered a double whiskey, unusual for him. He was usually very careful with alcohol, especially at family gatherings. But again, I decided not to give it importance. The conversation flowed easily at first. We talked about work, about my mother and Chuck's vacation plans, about the new house they were thinking of buying. Everything seemed normal, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't ignore. And then I noticed it. Chuck wouldn't stop looking at me. It wasn't a casual look. It was intense, almost predatory. Every time our eyes met, I felt as if he was undressing me with his gaze. I tried to focus on my plate, on the conversation, on anything but those eyes that seemed to want to devour me. Ryan, for his part, seemed oblivious to everything. He drank his whiskey as if it were water, ordering one after another. His face began to redden and his voice became louder, more careless. My mother looked at him with concern, but said nothing. As the night progressed, the situation became increasingly uncomfortable. Chuck began to make suggestive comments, disguised as innocent compliments. "Isabella, that dress suits you wonderfully. It highlights all your qualities," he said at one point, his eyes fixed on my neckline. I felt myself blushing, a mixture of shame and indignation bubbling inside me. I looked at Ryan, hoping he would say something, that he would defend me, but he was too busy ordering another drink. My mother, always the peacemaker, tried to change the subject. "So how are the anniversary plans going, guys? You must be excited, right?" Our anniversary. I had completely forgotten about it. Ryan and I would be celebrating 3 years of marriage in 2 weeks. We had talked about taking a trip, celebrating big. But lately, with work and stress, we hadn't mentioned the subject. Yeah, sure. I stammered, feeling guilty. We're planning something special. Ryan looked at me in confusion, as if he didn't know what I was talking about. Then, without warning, his head fell on the table with a thud. He had fallen asleep. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked at Ryan with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Chuck, on the other hand, seemed amused. "Well, looks like someone can't hold their liquor," he commented with a mocking smile. I felt humiliated and furious. How could Ryan do this to me? How could he embarrass me like this in front of my family? "I'm so sorry." I apologized, trying to wake Ryan up. "He's been working a lot lately and—" "Don't worry, dear," Chuck interrupted, his hand resting on mine. The contact made me shudder. These things happen. Why don't we go out for some fresh air while your mother stays with him? I looked at my mother, seeking help, but she just nodded with a forced smile. "Go ahead, honey. I'll stay with Ryan." Before I could protest, Chuck was guiding me out of the restaurant. The cool night air hit my face, and for a moment, I felt dizzy. Or maybe it was the effect of the wine I had been drinking during dinner. "I know a place nearby," Chuck said, his hand on the small of my back. "A bar with good music. We could go for a drink while we wait for your husband to recover." I knew I should say no. I knew I should go back to the restaurant, wake Ryan up and take him home. But I was angry, hurt, and although I'm ashamed to admit it, curious. What would happen if for once I let myself go? "Okay," I replied, surprising myself. "Let's go." The bar was just a few blocks away. It was an elegant place, with neon lights and music that made the floor vibrate. Chuck guided me to the bar, his hand never leaving my back. "2 martinis," he ordered the bartender, without even asking me what I wanted to drink. I took the martini when it was offered to me, taking a long sip. The alcohol burned my throat, but it also gave me a feeling of bravery that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Let's dance," Chuck suggested, or rather, ordered. Before I could respond, he was leading me to the dance floor. The music was loud, the lights flashing, and suddenly, I found myself in my stepfather's arms, moving to the rhythm of a song I didn't recognize. Chuck danced well. I had to admit it. His hands on my waist guided me with confidence, and for a moment I allowed myself to get lost in the music and movement. I closed my eyes, letting the alcohol and rhythm cloud my judgment. When I opened them again, Chuck was closer than I remembered, his face inches from mine, his eyes fixed on my lips. "I've always thought you were beautiful, Isabella," he murmured, his warm breath against my cheek. "Since the first day I saw you, I should have walked away, I should have told him to stop, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, motionless, as he brought his face closer to mine. His lips brushed mine, soft at first, then more insistent. I felt his tongue asking for entry, and to my horror and shame, I granted it. The kiss was passionate, urgent, full of tension that had been building for years. It was at that moment, with my stepfather's lips on mine, that I heard a scream that chilled my blood. "Isabella." I separated from Chuck as if he had burned me. There, in the middle of the dance floor, was Ryan. His face was a mask of pain, betrayal, and fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he roared, advancing towards us. Everything happened so fast after that. Ryan lunged at Chuck, his fist connecting with the older man's jaw. People around us screamed and moved away. I saw blood, heard the sound of punches and shouts. "Stop!" I screamed, trying to separate them. "Please stop." But it was as if they couldn't hear me. They kept fighting, rolling on the bar floor, hitting each other with a fury I had never seen in either of them. Finally, the security guards intervened, forcibly separating them. Ryan had a split lip and an eye that was already starting to swell. Chuck wasn't in better shape, with a bleeding nose and a torn shirt. "It's over," Ryan shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It's over, Isabella. I can't believe you did this to me. With your stepfather." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The reality of what I had done began to sink in. I had kissed Chuck. I had betrayed my husband, my mother, myself. Ryan, please. I pleaded, tears running down my cheeks. It's not what it looks like. But he was already walking away, pushing people out of his way towards the exit. The last thing I saw was his back disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, in the middle of the dance floor, feeling more alone than ever. Chuck tried to approach, but I pushed him away. Don't touch me, I hissed. This is your fault. I should never have come with you. I ran out of the bar, the cold night air hitting my face wet with tears. I didn't know where to go. I couldn't go home. I couldn't face Ryan. I couldn't go to my mother. Not after what I had done with her husband. Almost without thinking, my feet took me to my best friend, Marie's apartment. It was almost 2 a.m. when I knocked on her door, shaking and crying. Marie opened the door, her face going from surprise to concern in a matter of seconds. Izzy, what happened? I collapsed in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Between hiccups and tears, I told her everything that had happened. The dinner, the drinking, the dancing, the kiss, the fight. Marie listened in silence, rubbing my back and offering me tissues. Oh, Izzy, she sighed when I finished my story. What a mess you've gotten yourself into. I had no answer for that. I just knew that I had ruined everything, that I had destroyed my marriage, and probably my relationship with my mother in a single night. Marie offered me her couch for the night, and I fell into a restless sleep, plagued by nightmares, where Ryan was yelling at me and Chuck was chasing me. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a feeling of nausea that had nothing to do with the hangover. The reality of what I had done hit me with full force. I checked my phone with trembling hands. I had dozens of missed calls and messages. Most were from Ryan, some from my mother, and a few from Chuck. I didn't dare to read any of them. What am I going to do now? I asked Marie as she poured me a cup of coffee. She looked at me with a mixture of compassion and concern. I think the first thing you should do is talk to Ryan. He deserves an explanation. I knew she was right, but the idea of facing my husband terrified me. How could I explain what had happened when I didn't even fully understand it myself? With my heart in my throat, I dialed Ryan's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. And then, silence. He had hung up. I tried again. And this time, it went straight to voicemail. Ryan. I said, my voice breaking. Please. We need to talk. I'm so sorry. Please call me back. I spent the rest of the day in a constant state of anxiety, alternating between crying on Marie's shoulder and obsessively checking my phone. But Ryan didn't call. Finally, near nightfall, I received a text message. I'll be home at 8. We need to talk. Those few words filled me with terror and relief at the same time. At least he would give me the chance to explain myself. I arrived at our apartment a few minutes before 8. My hands were shaking so much I could barely open the door. The place was exactly as we had left it the night before. And somehow, that made it all more painful. As if time had stopped just before everything went to hell. Ryan arrived punctually. When he entered, I almost didn't recognize him. He had deep dark circles, his split lips still swollen, and an expression of pain that broke my heart. Ryan. I started, but he raised a hand to stop me. No, Isabella. Let me speak first, he said, his voice hoarse and tired. I've spent the last 24 hours trying to understand what happened last night, trying to understand how my wife, the woman I love and trust more than anyone in the world, could kiss her stepfather in front of my eyes. His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wanted to protest, to explain, but I knew I had to let him speak. I can't stop thinking about it. He continued, about how you looked in his arms, how you kissed him. I wonder if this has been happening behind my back all this time. If every time we had dinner with your mother and Chuck, you too. No, I exclaimed, unable to contain myself any longer. Ryan, I swear to you, nothing had ever happened before. It was a terrible mistake, a stupidity I committed in a moment of weakness. I was angry with you for falling asleep. I was confused. I had drunk too much. So it's my fault, he asked, his voice rising. Because I fell asleep, you decided to kiss your stepfather? No, that's not what I meant, I replied, desperate. I know there's no excuse for what I did. It was a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than I can express. Ryan ran a hand over his face, looking more tired than I had ever seen him. The problem, Isabella, is that I don't know if I can trust you again, he finally said. Every time I close my eyes, I see you kissing him. And I wonder if you were capable of doing that, what else would you be capable of? His words hit me hard. I knew he was right, that I had broken something fundamental in our relationship. Trust, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. Ryan, please, I begged, tears running down my cheeks. I love you, it was a terrible mistake. But I swear it will never happen again. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes a mixture of love and pain that broke my heart. I'm sorry, Isabella, he finally said. But I think we need some time apart. I can't be here right now. I can't look at you without thinking about what happened. I need space to think, to process all of this. I felt as if the ground was opening up beneath my feet. What do you mean? Are you leaving? He nodded slowly. I'll stay with my brother for a while. I need distance to think clearly about our future. Our future? I repeated. My voice barely a whisper. Do you still think we have a future together? Ryan was silent for a moment that seemed eternal. I don't know, Isabella. I really don't know. I watched him pack a suitcase in silence, unable to move or say anything else. When he finally headed for the door, he looked at me one last time. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk, he said. And then he was gone. I stood there, in the middle of our apartment, feeling more alone than ever. The reality of what I had done, of what I had lost, hit me with full force. I collapsed on the floor, crying uncontrollably. I don't know how long I spent like that, but eventually the sound of my phone pulled me out of my stupor. It was a message from my mother. Isabella, we need to talk. It's urgent. My heart sank even further. Of course, my mother. How could I forget that I hadn't just betrayed my husband, but her as well? With trembling hands, I replied that I would go see her the next day. I couldn't face her that night, not in the state I was in. That night, I slept on the couch. I couldn't bear the idea of sleeping in our bed, surrounded by Ryan's smell and the memories of our life together. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had been hit by a truck. My head was throbbing, my eyes were swollen from crying so much, and my heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest. I dragged myself to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I had smeared makeup, tangled hair, and an expression of total defeat on my face. What have you done, Isabella? I asked myself out loud. With a sigh, I showered and dressed mechanically. I had to face my mother, and I had no idea how I was going to explain what had happened. The car ride to my mother's house was torture. Every red light was an opportunity for my mind to replay the events of that fateful night, to imagine all the possible scenarios of how this conversation would go. When I finally arrived, I sat in the car for several minutes, gathering the courage to get out. Finally, with a deep sigh, I forced myself to walk to the door. My mother opened before I could ring the doorbell. Her face was pale and tense, with lines of worry I didn't remember seeing before. Isabella, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Come in. I followed her to the living room, noticing that the house was unusually quiet. Where's Chuck? I asked, almost fearing the answer. My mother sat on the couch, indicating that I should do the same. He's gone, she replied simply. I sat down, feeling as if the weight of the world was on my shoulders. Come in. I followed her to the living room, noticing that the house was unusually quiet. Where's Chuck? I asked, almost fearing the answer. My mother sat on the couch, indicating that I should do the same. He's gone, she replied simply. I sat down, feeling as if the weight of the world was on my shoulders. He told me everything, or at least his version of events. I felt my heart racing. What could Chuck have told her? He told me that you seduced him, my mother continued, her voice trembling slightly. That you took him to that bar with the intention of being with him. He said that you initiated the kiss, that he tried to stop you but that you were too drunk. I felt the blood freezing in my veins. Mom, that's not— Let me finish, she interrupted again. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't imagine that my daughter would do something like that. But then Chuck mentioned that it wasn't the first time you had shown interest in him. He said you had been flirting with him for years, sending him signals. Tears began to run down my cheeks. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Chuck had not only misrepresented what had happened that night, but he had invented a completely false story about our past interactions. Mom, I swear none of that is true, I said between sobs. Never, ever have I shown interest in Chuck. That night, it was a terrible mistake. I had drunk too much, I was angry with Ryan and Chuck. He took advantage of the situation. I was weak and made a horrible mistake. But I swear nothing had ever happened between us before. My mother looked at me for a long moment, her eyes full of pain and confusion. Why should I believe you, Isabella? Chuck is my husband. He's been by my side for years. Why would he lie about something like this? Her words hit me like a slap. And what am I, Mom? Am I not your daughter? Don't you know me better than anyone? Do you really believe I would be capable of doing something like that? I saw the conflict in her eyes, the internal struggle between believing her husband or her daughter. Finally, she let out a long sigh. I don't know what to believe, Isabella. All of this. It's too much. Chuck is gone. He said he needed time to think, to decide if he can forgive me for doubting him. I felt fury taking over me. Forgive you? Mom, he's the one who should be asking for forgiveness. He's manipulating you. Can't you see that? My mother stood up abruptly. I think you should go, Isabella. I need time to process all of this, to decide what to do. I stood up, feeling as if the world was crumbling around me. Mom, please. I need you. You can't believe him over me. But I saw in her eyes that, at least for now, she wasn't going to listen to me. With a broken heart, I headed for the door. I love you, Mom, I said before leaving. And I'm so sorry about all of this. I hope someday you can see the truth. I left my mother's house feeling completely devastated. In a matter of days, I had lost my husband, and now it seemed I had lost my mother too. All because of a moment of weakness. Because of a mistake I should never have made. I drove aimlessly through the city, tears blurring my vision. I didn't know where to go. I couldn't go back home. I couldn't face the loneliness of that apartment full of memories. Almost without realizing it, I found myself parking in front of Marie's building. My friend welcomed me with open arms, without asking questions. She let me cry on her shoulder for hours, offering me tissues and words of comfort. You can stay here as long as you need, she finally told me. You don't have to face this alone. I nodded, grateful to have at least one person in my life who was still on my side. The following days passed in a kind of haze. I moved around Marie's apartment like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping. Ryan hadn't called me. My mother wasn't responding to my messages. And Chuck? Well, it was better not to think about Chuck. It was Marie who finally pulled me out of my stupor. Isabella, she told me one morning, sitting next to me on the couch. You can't go on like this. You need to face what happened and decide what you're going to do now. I looked up from the coffee cup I had been staring at for the past hour. What can I do, Marie? I've ruined everything. She took my hand in hers. You've made a mistake, yes. A big mistake. But that doesn't mean your life is over. You have to decide how you're going to move forward. Her words penetrated the fog of self-pity I had been living in. She was right. I couldn't go on like this indefinitely. Where do I start? I asked, feeling lost. I think the first thing is that you need to talk to a therapist, Marie suggested. Someone who can help you process everything that's happened and understand why you did what you did. The idea of talking to a stranger about my problems terrified me. But I knew Marie was right. I needed professional help to navigate this mess I had gotten myself into. And I think you should consider looking for a job, she continued. Something to keep you busy and give you a purpose. I nodded slowly. I had left my job a year ago to focus on writing a novel, a dream that now seemed so distant and trivial. "You're right," I finally said. "I can't keep hiding from the world." That afternoon, I made my first appointment with a therapist. I also updated my resume and started looking for job offers. It was a small start, but it felt like a step in the right direction. The following weeks were a constant challenge. Every morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach, remembering everything I had lost. But little by little, with the help of therapy and Marie's unconditional support, I began to face my demons. In our sessions, Dr. Rodriguez helped me explore the motives behind my actions on that fateful night. We talked about my relationship with Ryan, about the problems we had been ignoring for months. "Isabella," she told me in one of our sessions, "what you did was a mistake, but it didn't come out of nowhere. There were underlying problems in your marriage that need to be addressed." I reflected on her words. It was true that Ryan and I had been growing apart lately. Work was consuming him more and more, and I had immersed myself in my writing, creating an invisible wall between us. "But that doesn't justify what I did," I protested. "No, it doesn't justify it," Dr. Rodriguez agreed. "But understanding the context can help you forgive yourself and work to be a better person in the future." Forgiving myself, that was the hardest part. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the expression of pain on Ryan's face, the disappointment in my mother's eyes. How could I forgive myself for causing them so much pain? Meanwhile, my job search finally bore fruit. I got a position as an editor at a small publishing house. It wasn't my dream job, but it kept me busy and gave me a daily purpose. One day, while reviewing a manuscript at my new desk, I received a message from Ryan. My heart raced when I saw his name on the screen. "We need to talk. Can you meet me at our usual cafe tomorrow at 5? My hands were shaking as I responded affirmatively. After weeks of silence, I would finally have the opportunity to talk to him face to face. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. When I finally arrived at the cafe, Ryan was already there, sitting.